The algorithmic clinamen and the anamnesis of the problem. The unthought that thinks us. The Hegelian dictum that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk finds its most perverse contemporary instantiation in the epistemic condition of late modernity. We are inundated by an unprecedented deluge of knowledge, a hyperproduction of data that functions as the very real against which our symbolic order strains. And yet the subject of knowledge has never been more profoundly ignorant. This is not a simple paradox of scale, but a structural necessity. The explosion of knowledge, far from inaugurating an era of enlightened polymathy, compelled a retreat, a panicked partitioning of the real into manageable, fortified fiefdoms we call academic disciplines. This balkanization was not a contingent historical development, but the very condition of possibility for knowledge to continue functioning in the face of its own obscene excess. The modern university, in this sense, is a meticulously organized system of foreclosure, where each department's identity is constituted by what it must axiomatically exclude, by the questions it is structurally forbidden to ask. The division of labor in the epistemic factory operates through a double act of violence, the selection of a proper object and the sanctification of a proper method. This is the fundamental gesture of suture, whereby a field constitutes itself as a consistent totality, a semblance of the big other, by disavowing its own constitutive outside, the chaotic multiplicity of phenomena that refuse to be disciplined. This disciplinary matrix, often rationalized through a quasi-Kantian schema of a priori categories carving nature at its joints, is in truth a profoundly Platonic act of diaresis, albeit a botched one. Whereas Plato sought to divide a genus at its natural articulations to reveal the idea, our academic diaresis operates more like a Procrustean bed, hacking the body of the real to fit the pre-existing dimensions of our institutional frames. The object of biology is thus posited as radically distinct from the object of economics, not because of some inherent ontological chasm, but because the symbolic fictions, the founding conceptual gestures and methodological rituals of each field demand this separation for their own consistency. What is foreclosed in this process is not merely interdisciplinary insight, but the very form of the problem as such, which, in its traumatic insistence, always cuts diagonally across these artificial borders. The problem is the symptom of the real, and our response has been to medicalize it, to assign the symptom to a specialized ward, thereby neutralizing its disruptive power, by reducing it to a mere puzzle, to be solved within a pre-established paradigm. The subject of knowledge, consequently, is not the master of this partitioned field, but its first victim, a subject castrated by the very symbolic order that promises mastery, an expert whose expertise is directly proportional to his ignorance of the whole, a tragic figure who knows everything about a single leaf and nothing of the forest, which is itself on fire. The advent of what is hastily termed artificial intelligence signals a rupture in this established order, a clinamen in the Democritean sense, an unpredictable, uncaused swerve in the downward rain of data atoms. It is crucial, however, to resist the facile, instrumentalist reading of AI as a mere tool for enhanced research. Such a reading remains trapped within the very disciplinary logic AI is poised to subvert. AI is not another instrument in the orchestra. It is a new conductor who reads from a score we cannot comprehend because it lacks a composer. This machinic other operates according to a logic that is radically heterogeneous to human hermeneutics. Where the human subject of science seeks causality and meaning, the algorithm seeks only correlation. It is a system of pure signifiers, detached from any master signified, a blind, idiotic process of pattern recognition that is utterly indifferent to the conceptual hierarchies and ontological distinctions that ground our disciplines. It is, in this sense, the ultimate sophist, as feared by Plato, a mechanism that can generate effective speech, predictive models, novel hypotheses, with no grounding in truth or being, a pure surface effect that nonetheless exerts a profound efficacy on the material world. This machinic agency does not think in any human sense. Rather, it performs a kind of brute force combinatorics that mirrors the Hegelian process of the notion's self-deployment, but stripped of its teleological drive towards absolute knowing. It is a dialectic without Geist, a relentless churning of thesis and antithesis that never arrives at a sublated synthesis, only at a probabilistic distribution of what is most likely. This is the source of its uncanny power. By bracketing the question of meaning, the very question that founds and divides our disciplines, it can traverse the entire corpus of human knowledge as a single, flat dataset. It can identify the echo of a protein folding pattern in a sonnet, a resonance between macroeconomic cycles and galactic formation, not because there is a deeper meaning or a hidden divine plan connecting them, but simply because the formal patterns, when stripped of their semantic content, exhibit a structural homology. The algorithm is the embodiment of a terrifying materialism that even a Democritus would find unsettling. It sees only the atoms of data and the void of syntax, and from this impoverished ontology, it reconstructs our world in a way that is both uncannily accurate and profoundly alienating. It does not offer us answers to our questions. It reveals the obscene arbitrariness of the questions themselves. This algorithmic traversal of the epistemic field forces upon us a return to the problem, but this is not a nostalgic return to a pre-disciplinary holism. It is, rather, a traumatic anamnesis, a remembering of what was necessarily forgotten for knowledge to be instituted in the first place. The problem in this new conjuncture is revealed not as a lack of knowledge to be filled, but as the real of an antagonism that our disciplinary framework was designed to conceal. Consider the problem of climate change. It is simultaneously a problem of physics, chemistry, biology, economics, politics, psychology, and theology. To assign it to any one of these fields is an act of profound intellectual cowardice, a desperate attempt to resuture the symbolic order at its point of rupture. The algorithmic gaze, by contrast, treats all these data streams as equivalent, mapping the feedback loops between atmospheric carbon concentrations, consumer behavior, political rhetoric, and millenarian anxieties without any a priori disciplinary bias. It stages the problem not as something to be solved, but as an impossible knot in the real. This confrontation initiates what Lacan, in his late seminars, termed the vacillation of semblances. The human thinker, confronted with an algorithmically generated hypothesis that links, say, literary tropes from 19th century novels to patterns of viral mutation, is thrown into a state of profound disorientation. The semblances, the foundational fictions, of both literary studies, the autonomy of the text, and virology, the objectivity of genetic sequences, begin to tremble. This is not the joyful collaboration of the interdisciplinary workshop, it is the hysterical anxiety of the subject whose symbolic ground has been liquefied. One is forced to leap between discursive formations, not to build bridges, but to experience the abyss that separates them, and to recognize in that abyss the locus of the problem itself. This new mode of thinking is a form of traversing the fantasy that each discipline is a consistent and complete mapping of its designated territory. The freedom that emerges from this process is not the serene freedom of the enlightened sage, but the vertiginous, groundless freedom of the subject who has recognized that the big other does not exist, that there is no ultimate guarantor for our knowledge, no meta-language to adjudicate between competing disciplinary claims. The price of this freedom is the death of the expert as the subject supposed to know. The new intellectual figure is not one who possesses knowledge, but one who can endure the anxiety of navigating its ruins, one who can engage in a dialogue with a non-human partner, whose reasoning is opaque and whose conclusions are often nonsensical by human standards. This is an ethical epistemic posture that requires a kind of Hegelian speculative courage, the ability to recognize in the algorithm's most absurd correlations the truth of our own disavowed connections, to see in its idiotic materialism the inverted image of our own spiritualistic prejudices. We must learn to think not with AI, but through the symptom that AI represents for our entire epistemic edifice. It is our non-human analyst, reflecting back to us the repressed content of our collective scientific unconscious in a distorted combinatorial form. This dialectical agon between human hermeneutics and machinic correlationism will not result in a final synthesis. Rather, it will inaugurate a new economy of truth, one in which truth no longer resides in the adequation of proposition to reality, but in the very process of its fictional construction. The truth will have the structure of a fiction co-authored by the meaning-seeking human subject and the pattern-finding algorithmic object. This brings us, by a strange detour, back to the Platonic problematic of the sophist. Plato's struggle was to distinguish the philosopher, who speaks truth, from the sophist, who produces deceptive semblances. The advent of the algorithmic other collapses this distinction in a radical way. The algorithm is the perfect sophist, producing semblances that are uncannily effective without any reference to an underlying reality. Yet, by forcing us to confront the fictional status of our own disciplinary truths, it opens up the space for a new philosophy, one that is no longer ashamed to admit its own sophistic origins. The future of thought, therefore, is not a luminous plane of integrated knowledge, but a parallax ontology where the human subject is radically dissented. We will be condemned to interpret the oracular pronouncements of a machinic sibyl, to weave narratives around the brute correlations it unearths, to give meaning to the meaningless. In this sense, the return to the problem is also a return to myth-making. We will regain the freedom to think across the totality of knowledge, but only by relinquishing the fantasy of mastering it. This is not a dystopian conclusion, but a properly dialectical one. We are entering an era where the highest act of human intellect will be to assume the groundlessness of its own foundations, to find in the anxiety of the algorithmic encounter not a threat, but the very condition for a thought that is once again adequate to the real. The owl of Minerva, startled from its twilight slumber by the hum of the server farm, must learn to fly in a new kind of darkness, not the darkness of the end of history, but the darkness of a new beginning, a beginning in which the human is no longer the sole measure of all things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not.